That's too big, Mom.
Then make it small. Focus on my voice. Pretend it's an island out in the ocean. Can you see it?
I see it.
My son was in the bus. He saw what Clark did.
You have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
I have so many questions. Where do I come from?
You just have to decide what kind of man you want to grow up to be, Clark. Whoever that man is, he's going to change the world.
The world found out who I really was, they'd reject me. He was convinced that the world wasn't ready. What do you think?
Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Perone, and joining me today we have Tony. Say hi, Tony.
Hey, Carlos.
And Steve. Hi, Steve.
Hey, gentlemen.
We are all three of us in the same room in an undisclosed location somewhere in Queens, and we are together to talk about one of the summer blockbusters I would consider.
One of the controversial summer blockbusters.
Yes, and there's lots of potential blockbusters this summer, but this one is Man of Steel, the latest reincarnation of the Superman franchise. Let's talk a little bit about what we've had in the past first. What were the most famous reincarnations of Superman, and how this one kind of fits in, and who made it, and why?
Well, how far back do you want to go?
Well, obviously we know that this used to be a black and white serial, and at some point they made the big Christopher Reeve film
right.
that we've had a commentary about not too long ago.
Not too long ago, right? We did on the original by Richard Donner. But prior to that, you had a serial in 1948, which was the first live-action version with Kirk Allen as Superman. Well, I think he did two serials. Then there was a serial starring George Reeves. I'm sorry, that was a film. That wasn't a serial. That was a film. And that gave birth to the Superman television series, which I believe, and they'll jump all over me if I'm wrong, led to 6-season or 7-season TV show with George Reeves. And then there was also an unaired Superboy pilot in 1961, which I have.
Oh, my God.
And starring John Rockwell as Superboy. I mean, it was never aired, but it exists in the bootleg community, of which I am a proud member. And
the FBI is already at your door.
So then that was it for live action until... Well, no. Things keep coming to me. There was a Broadway play in the mid-'60s. I don't remember the man's name, but Linda Lavin was in it. And my mom and dad actually saw it. It was not a hit. Then they did a live-action adaptation of that play on ABC. I have this copy of this, too. And again, I can't remember the guy's name who played Superman, but Leslie Ann Warren was Lois Lane. Peter Boyle is in it, I think. And it's horrible.
Oh, my God.
Then you have Richard Donner's Superman in 1978 and the franchise that followed that.
Lois and Clark.
In the 90s.
Right. And
then
Smallville. And
then,
obviously on cartoons, there were plenty of Superman appearances since the beginning and in the 70s and the 80s.
60s even. 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Now, tell me something.
And Brandon Routh.
The last go-around was
Superman
him.
Returns.
Now, tell me something, because this is something that we're going to talk about when we talk about this particular film, and that is, what was the tone of the original incarnations of Superman as it relates to the comic book? In other words, comic book was comic book, traditional comic book, strong man, no dark sides. It was just good guy, bad guy, no shades of gray anywhere. And were those type of themes also carried on to the earlier versions, the black and whites?
Well, I read in Entertainment Weekly recently, because they had a Superman issue, that when Superman started in Action Comics, he wasn't the indestructible force that we know him as today. He wasn't necessarily bulletproof. He was just a super strong guy. He couldn't fly. What he would do is he would jump in leaps and bounds, basically. And he didn't start flying until the movies decided to translate the story into a film, and they figured jumping from place to place looked kind of dopey, so they made him fly. And as the...
Like the Hulk?
I guess so. And as his mythos grew and everything, that's how the indestructibility came about.
A lot of things that we know today in terms of his myth came about late 40s, early 50s. I don't think Lex Luthor entered the picture until Superboy was created, which is like 10 years after Superman. There was no Superboy. There was no implication that he had ever been a hero before he emerged in Metropolis. But I guess the powers that be thought it was just another way to milk the character. So they created this Superboy thing, and then Lex Luthor with the hair falling out, and he always hated Superboy and blah, blah, blah. And I think they used Lex Luthor as villain in one of the George Reeves movies that predate the series. Mm-hmm. And I think Kryptonite didn't even come around. Again, I'm not a Superman expert by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm not sure when it came about, but none of these things were present in Action Comics #1 in 1938.
But let me also ask you, by the time we get to Donner's Superman, there's definitely a change in tone, even for that time. In other words, we're coming from a very, not simplistic, but, he's the good guy. There is no phases to him at all. He's just one character.
But I think
and with
he's
Donner,
always like that.
I think that, as Tony pointed out, in the very beginning and maybe into the early 40s, there was an element of, I don't even know if darkness is the right word, but by the late 40s and 50s, he's the square-jawed, mom and apple pie, truth, justice, and the American way hero that we know, and the TV series with George Reeves parallels that incarnation of the character, and that goes forth throughout the 60s and early 70s. Superman, even when the sort of, and Tony might know what I'm referencing, in the early 70s and late 60s, again, kind of going with the tone of what was happening in the country, there was in comics like a shift towards relevance. And especially Green Lantern and characters, even Batman, relevance, darkness, all this is, But Superman, it never really took with. He never really, he was never exploring his dark side. He wasn't dealing with social issues.
You talk about like what they did with Batman in the 90s and stuff like that, or like Watchmen, that kind of dark superhero thing?
In the late 60s and early 70s, Green Lantern, there was like a tonal shift that happened like from one issue to the next with a new creator and a new writer and artist, where they just started dealing in a very heavy-handed way with like social issues that were happening in the late 60s. And other comics, even Spider-Man, dealt with that, drugs, things like that, dealt with that, But DC, with Superman, they never really...
They kept them clean.
They never really got into it.
I didn't read Superman that much when I was a kid, but I don't think he was ever the tortured hero like we're talking about. Like Spider-Man, he lost Gwen Stacy. He was a tortured hero, Uncle Ben. Superman didn't really have that in his background. I don't know that any of the major Superman characters, the equivalent of Pa Kent, in a way, passing on. But like the Gwen Stacy thing.
The tragedy,
that was a huge thing in Spider-Man comics. Yes. I don't know that Superman ever dealt with that. I mean, I don't know whatever happened to Lana Lang or anything like that.
And Pa Kent, depending on whatever generation you were dealing with, he was either dead or he was alive. He was dead, he was alive. It didn't define him in a way that the Richard Donner movie, he dies in that.
That's a little deeper.
Yeah, in the Lois and Clark TV show, he survived throughout the whole run. So he was always that character, alive, dead, But in the Donner film, that was a defining moment. His death was a defining moment.
So you could say that the Donner film was the first time we got to see a little deeper, maybe a slight twinge of a darker side, or just a deeper side of the character that you didn't see in the past.
I didn't get any dark impressions of Superman in that.
Him struggling with the death of Lois and stuff like that.
The Lois, I mean, he is obviously enraged at her
and
death.
doing you spin the world around for one woman.
Yeah, I know.
That's a little.
I mean, I guess in that sense, I mean, yeah, I would go with that.
Right. And now the TV shows, because of the nature of being television, and because of the nature you have to write so much material that's fresh, you have the opportunity to delve into certain areas that normally in a film you don't have a chance.
Oh, yeah.
Lois and Clark, many seasons. Smallville, my God.
Yeah.
What was that, 10 seasons?
Yeah.
They had to explore everything and just make stuff up because there was so much things needed to fill the airtime.
Right.
The next time we get a chance or a crack at a Superman story in film is the Bryan Singer. The Bryan Singer version, which
is an homage to Richard Donner.
Yeah,
right.
He even said it was that.
And in itself, it also, aside from the fact that it wasn't such a successful film as the original Superman film, the Christopher Reeve film, it also brought its own series of controversy in terms of how they tweaked the story in terms of him possibly, most likely, having a son.
A child.
Mm-hmm. And that was, again...
Didn't go over too well.
Didn't make the fans very happy. No. But I wouldn't say that's what killed the film. The film just kind of wasn't that great.
Yeah, it was just... I think it was too reverential of the Donner film without having its own identity. And I think that it was a little bloated. It was too long. And I think it tread over familiar ground. But I hated the son. I really couldn't stand that element of the film. I just wanted to, before we get into Man of Steel and everything, and I wanted to ask Tony... because I know you didn't read the comic. What was your experience reading the comic, if any?
Honestly, I don't remember reading much of Superman. I mean, I remember the special. I remember getting, was it World's Finest? Was that with Superman and Batman?
Yeah, and Batman and
Brave
all the other heroes.
I remember getting the Superman versus Spider-Man giant size.
Me too,
Superman versus Muhammad Ali.
Oh, yeah.
So it was, I think the 70s when I was reading still Superman a little bit, it was probably much more of an innocent time. Yeah. Even Batman hadn't become that dark yet. I mean, the Batman darkness really happened with Frank Miller, which was about the mid-'80s, I guess.
The Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah. Basically, what I remember of Superman is that, he's kind of a Boy Scout and he does the right thing. Somehow, the writers, since he has this, he's basically indestructible, that they had to come up with some ways to threaten him, put him in jeopardy, or the ones he loves in jeopardy.
Right.
But, like I said, he was never that tortured soul.
Right. And, I have to say that as a comic reader... he never really spoke to me in terms of liking the... Well, how could you dislike Superman? But I didn't really read him until when I did start to explore the character was when DC had the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was in the mid-'80s, where they rebooted their line, and it was a good entry point for me with their characters. And John Byrne, who was a quite notable creator of comics in our generation, was given Superman, and he sort of depowered him. Obviously still could do a lot of the things, but he wasn't like, he couldn't throw the moon into the sun or something ludicrous. And he was the one who sort of made Lex Luthor into the Donald Trumpy character that he became. And because I loved Byrne, I read the comic and I stuck with it probably up until the death of Superman in the early 90s. But he never grabbed me as a character, whereas the Donner film, the first two, really I loved. And even though he's the same character as he's portrayed in the comic, but I think to a certain extent that's down to Christopher Reeve's performance. I just loved him as Superman, loved him as Clark.
I mean, I would be interested at this point in my life to go back and read some of the older Superman comics and see if maybe I can relate to them more today, because maybe when we were kids or teenagers, I always felt more akin to Peter Parker.
Me too.
So, he was the put-upon teenager, wanted to do well. Superman, there wasn't that connection with. He didn't really have that going for him. So I'd be curious. Maybe I'll buy one of those, what do you call them, essential editions or whatever, and revisit some old Superman stories just to see what it was like back then.
Now, not too long ago, when we first heard that they wanted to reboot the franchise again, originally it was one of these situations which we talked about in the past where it's like, why? We just had it happen not too long ago, not very successfully, of course. And then they threw out a name of Zack Snyder, and at the time, I think he was just recovering
From
or in
Sucker
the midst of
Punch.
Sucker Punch, which like, oh my God, why would this man do that? Now, one of the funny things I remember about Zack Snyder, and don't get me wrong, I loved Dawn of the Dead. The Watchmen was pretty good. It was a very
I liked Watchmen.
different vision for a superhero film. The film wasn't as successful, but there was some very interesting visuals that he connects it. And then 300, obviously before that, again, very visual, comic book, a different way of looking at a comic book.
Right.
But Sucker Punch was such a disaster, apparently, that I could not understand why would they pick him.
I was a little
See,
shocked.
that's the question I asked after seeing Man of Steel.
And we're going to get to that.
But I'll tell you, here's the funny thing. I remember there was this April Fool's joke going on, I don't know how many years ago, definitely before he was picked to direct Man of Steel.
Yeah.
And they were sending out this messages going, Zack Snyder picked to reboot Star Wars. He's going to do episode 4. And it's all about Jar Jar. And it was like, he was almost like a joke now in terms of, why would they let him do that?
Right.
But I guess part of it has to do with the success of the Dark Knight trilogy, Christopher Nolan's trilogy, and the fact that he now was going to be involved from a producing standpoint. He
and
was gonna
David
direct it.
Goyer is the writer.
Right, which is that's the Batman people.
Right.
And then, we started to see pictures, and it's like, and again, when you see these set pictures, they look awful to me. They always look bad because it's like they showed you the costume. It's like he looks like he's in his
unitard?
underwear or something.
Yeah,
The suit doesn't look right.
And they took away the red briefs.
Yeah, and it's like, what are they doing? And whatever. So you're like, okay, well, hey, it's coming. There's nothing we can do about it. Hopefully Nolan can have some good influence. But at the same time, a lot of us kind of understood Nolan was going to put a different, if he had any influence over this,
tone.
He was going to put a different tone, a different touch, a different feel to this particular film. And then we got the first trailer. And I think off the bat in that trailer, which was not very different than the follow-up trailers, but the initial trailer of him walking in the snow kind of thing and shooting up in the air and the shaking of the ground and the breaking the sound barrier and the music. Oh my God. It was like, holy crap.
Hans Zimmer
is different.
He's a great composer.
He's amazing. And then obviously the film is released. We saw it. We all saw it in different manners. I think I might have seen it in 3D. Did you guys see it in 3D
I
or
saw it in 3D.
regular?
I saw it regular.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's begin our discussion.
Okay.
In terms of, why don't you tell us a little bit about, or Tony or Steve, how the story, I mean, obviously we all know the story, the basic story, but let's talk about a little bit how they deal with it differently.
Well, I mean, as you pointed out,
it's an origin story.
It's an origin story, and they really don't change the basics, but they do. The film does kind of mimic that Batman Begins, where they kind of jump around in time, not as drastically as Batman Begins did, because you have the literal beginning of the story,
Right.
Krypton and all that stuff, but then there are moments of flashback.
He's like in his 20s, but then he's like a little kid remembering his farm days.
His farm days and his dad and mom and all that kind of stuff. And like I said, they don't jump around quite as much. And obviously we're dealing with no Lex Luthor. We're dealing
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet. And again, I think this is also kind of a throwback to Batman Begins, where you're saving the big guy for the second film, if there is one, which there probably will be.
Right.
You're dealing with General Zod, who was as well known to everybody, and
Technically, he was in the first film, but he really was in the second film.
He was the villain of the second piece. And, it's that story again. But, yeah, you're dealing with, I'd say, a little bit more inner conflict, and based primarily on how he is raised by Pa Kent, in terms of, even though there's that element, which I thought was a tiny homage to the Donner film, you are here for a reason. Mm-hmm. But yet, at the same time, he's kind of like, but don't show it, and the real controversy here is, and yes, let people die if it means, revealing yourself at the wrong time, before you're ready, before the world is ready. That was, I think, the one really huge piece of controversy.
Well, I think, again, maybe it's open for interpretation, but to me it almost felt like that was something he was telling him as an option. In other words, I don't think he was telling him what to do. I think he was giving him his options. In other words, it might be better not to do anything about it, but you can do things. It's like you have both of them, and he's trying to save him as a kid because he knows that as a kid he can't really even though he has powers, he can't defend himself against the entire world.
Finding out. The scene in question is Clark winds up saving a school bus full of children, his classmates that drove off a bridge accidentally and sunk into the water, and everybody was going to drown until he revealed his power. Well, he saved them by lifting up the bus and then lifting up the bully.
Yeah.
Well, we only see two people see them.
Yeah.
There's the bully, who I think his name is Pete, and then there's Lana Lang.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I mean, that Pa Kent scene didn't really sit right with me, because even I didn't get the impression he was, offering it as an option, like to kind of test Clark's character. I think, to me, it suggested like he was saying, you should have really just considered letting them die.
Yeah.
And I mean,
because you're inviting trouble.
Yeah, and to bring in another point of view, for fairness, I will call him Mr. Slick. He's a big fan of Man of Steel. He did say that as a father, Pa Kent basically was acting as a father, looking out for the interest of his son when he was telling him that, because as a parent, that's what you do. You're not overly concerned with everybody else. You're concerned primarily for your son. So to me, that's like maybe the only logical rationale that fits. But Pa Kent... But that whole thing didn't sit right with me. And I like Kevin Costner. I thought he did a fine job. I thought the cast of everything was wonderful. I just thought the movie was kind of crappy.
See, that's the thing. Again, we're going deep here into this, and this is all
that the
theories.
point?
Yeah, I know. But what I'm saying is, let's just say, for example, if your son is capable of standing up to bullies, let's say, would you encourage him to go and stand up to every bully?
I would encourage him to be careful about it.
But that's the thing. It's like there's a certain point where you don't want to test your capabilities too much in public, because it's like too much. You said draw too much attention to yourself. In this case, yes, it could cost people lives. But at the same time, would you tell your son, if you're in a bank and somebody comes to rob the bank and you think you can take them on, take them on?
Well,
it's like, no.
But he's bulletproof. Your son
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think even Kevin Costner's character at that time understands exactly what his capabilities are. He knows he can do very incredible things. I don't know did we see a scene of him being shot?
I don't.
Hey, like in Kick-Ass, go over there. I'm going to shoot you now.
But there was the scene where he kind of, I think, he implies that he knows he can do things, because there's that flashback to him as getting bullied.
Yeah.
And
and he's bending the metal.
Yeah. And Costner is kind of saying.
But like I said, I think he could. To me, Pa Kent is more in the Uncle Ben line. You teach your kid with great power comes great responsibility. So that to me, saying. Maybe you should have let the kids in the bus die. And frankly, by saving the kids in the bus, if he had been a little more careful, he didn't necessarily have to let very many people. You could push the bus up to the shore and kind of duck back down under the water and pretend you got thrown out or something. So,
but he did have to save Pete too, who was out of the bus.
That's true. That's true. And honestly, even the Pa Kent death scene, something about it just it just didn't sit right with me.
When I saw him, he's saying people can't see what I'm doing, but he's gesturing
Pa Kent is gesturing to
do not come save me.
Yeah.
To really drive home his point, he's willing to die.
Yeah.
And
would you say that's a way of a character showing a certain point of view of, for the better good? It's better to let a few people die than a lot of people die. Could it be that thing in terms of saying it's better to keep this quiet now than to risk it today?
I think it was done that way because of what we were talking about before. Clark Kent, Superman, was never the tortured soul like Spider-Man, who lost his uncle in such a horrific manner, getting shot. I think that's what the filmmakers wanted to do, to give, Clark this motivation. But I don't really feel that. I never really got the impression that was what motivated him through the film. Like, he let his father die, so now he has to keep other people from dying. It was just almost like...
Well, about 100,000 people must have died during the Battle of Metropolis.
Yeah. Because it's like, Pa Kent said to just let him die and keep his secret. He's not ready yet. And Clark went along with it, and he was sad about it. And it just something about... I just didn't care for the script.
This brings up a much larger question that has been debated since the movie came out. I had sent it to you guys, and I don't know if Tony had a chance to read it. I think you did. An article that was written, or a blog that was written about the heroes of today. Yes. Very thought-provoking, no matter what side of the issue you fall upon, or you're behind. And, we've talked about this before in the podcast and, just with each other. is this necessary to have a character like Superman? In order to make him relevant, do you have to show his fallibilities? Do you have to make him dark? I mean, I kind of agree with this to a certain extent, even though I wasn't the one who wrote the article. But it's like, these are characters we're supposed to look up to, supposed to be inspired by. And so what if they're not necessarily completely relatable, or you have to show their humanity to such an extent that you have to show their dark side, or you have to show these things happening to them. There are characters like Superman, like Captain America, who just kind of are good.
Yeah.
Fundamentally good. And yes, they do have human fallibility and issues and whatever, but you had a character like Captain America in the film that came out a couple of years ago, where there really wasn't
just a good guy.
He was just a good guy.
It was like a good old World War II.
Right.
There really wasn't a whole hell of a lot.
I'll tell you something. Again, it must be a preference thing, but to me, Captain America felt a little cheesy to me. Now, I enjoy the film, but there was this whole...
Well, that's what people are saying about the Donner Superman now. Like slick.
But it's what I would consider to be classic Superman. It's, the black and white. There is no gray.
Well,
everything is pristine.
Is that okay? I mean, isn't that okay?
I think in terms of Captain America, I have a feeling they're probably going to introduce a little more grayness now that he's in the modern world.
Yeah.
I mean, it was also the setting of the movie, which was a more... I mean, if
innocent
you want to call...
time.
The genocide of millions of people a more innocent time.
Right, but it also had this feel of stereotypical World War II. And here come their young boys. They're coming to the war, and look how proud they are. Mom is baking the apple pie.
And what's wrong with that?
But it's I don't even know what the word for it is, but it's a phony...
But it's not
unrealistic.
phony.
Well, it's a nostalgic...
It's a nostalgic, exactly,
Yeah.
but it's not Saving Private Ryan.
No, but it wasn't intended to be.
It wasn't intended to be.
Right,
and
but,
it's a comic book.
that's why. But I think that the reason is because maybe comic books are supposed to be meant for kids, very young kids. They're not ready for the darkness.
Well,
they're ready for black and white, good and evil. But you can't really get into sometimes good people do bad things and sometimes bad people do good things.
Well, comic books in the old days were more like that. I think nowadays they're probably more geared towards older kids and adults.
What's interesting, and I was having this discussion with another one of our friends, is we're unique in terms of Tony and I, comic book reading. Like, we started reading comics in the late 70s when they were... like I said, the tone was different. There wasn't too much darkness, really. That sort of happened in the mid-'80s with Dark Knight, with Watchmen, stuff like that. And it's almost like they were growing up with us. So nowadays, there's not really that entry point for kids like your son's age or younger to kind of get in there and
in an innocent
way,
right.
And before they're ready, because what's out there predominantly is geared towards much older people, much older readers. Whereas we came in sort of at the tail end of, the 50s. I mean, I could read a comic today from the 50s and be like, holy cow. And the 60s, even the stuff I loved seems a little silly. The Spider-Man comics, and I've read them all, and then the 70s, it gets a little bit darker, a little bit more relevant, and these new writers come along and they felt the need to be relevant, to be socially conscious, to introduce human foibles into these heroes to make them more relatable. And I was just kind of along for the ride. As it happened, I happened to be growing up and I happened to be getting more mature, and I sort of embraced that. I loved Dark Knight, I loved Watchmen, and I was just the right age for them. But kids younger than me was no way. It's just not for them.
Right.
I mean, first of all, I think Batman always had that quality to him, so I didn't really mind it. I didn't even mind showing a darker version of Superman. Not darker, but, more foibles. And actually, I don't even think he had that many foibles in the movie. I don't have a problem with trying to make the character more relatable. I just don't think the execution was well done. The movie was a large degree of form over substance.
We'll talk a little bit more about what really bothered you. No, really. I mean,
Well, let's take it from the beginning. I loved Krypton.
I hated the opening.
Really? I've never seen a portrayal of a planet in that manner. The technology, the architecture, the animals, all that weird stuff. It's like, wow, it's different. It's actually
And again,
different.
that's form. To me, I was sitting there watching and think, the first thought is like, wow, everything's really loud on Krypton. And then it was like,
maybe
it was like,
Tony,
okay.
did you adjust the hearing aid before going into the movie?
And then it was, then we started getting into the codex and like when then Russell Crowe is diving under the water and same people are after him and there's Zod and these other people. As this 20-minute elaborate setup of this complicated codex crap that's supposed to play out later in the movie. And it's like, I just didn't really care. It's like these people are giving their son away, and I just didn't connect with it at that point. And it's from that point on, it still turned into the most bombastically loud movie I've ever seen. And that's why I didn't see the 300, because it looked like it was just a lot of people pummeling each other.
The 300,
okay?
Not just pummeling.
Edith, did you watch the Seinfeld last night? That Seinfeld boy is so funny.
And the swearing.
Oh my
God, the swearing.
Put on the TV show. Come on.
As I wrote in my review, was it just 300 or the 300?
It was
300.
300.
Was there
And
a
the
comic?
rock and roll.
Let's
and
go.
the Beatles with their long hair.
Turn up the Star Wars. It's so loud. And the robots and the Wookiees. What's a Wookiee?
What the hell is a Jawa? What kind of picture is this?
What the
You
hell?
all go post your
They're stealing my hubcaps, those damn Jawas. Oh, my God.
Go post your snide comments on the Facebook.
The Facebook. My daughter calls it the Book of Faces, which is what it originally was called.
Yeah.
As I wrote in my review of Man of Steel years ago, Brian, who is also a guest on Geekfest Rants quite often, we were talking and said as we got older, we got tired of reading fight scenes in comic books because they didn't really amount to just a lot of like 8 to 10 pages of people throwing each other into buildings and nothing was really happening that moved the story forward. And I felt like a lot of Man of Steel was that kind of... It was a ton of action scenes with like barely taking, time for a breath to just even create some kind of human moment.
And I agree with Tony on that. Even though I like the film,
Yes.
I agree with, the whole last hour of the film is just an assault on your senses.
It's difficult to me, it was almost Transformer-ish in terms
Yeah.
of
Yes.
who's
Which-
punching who and and why. And again,
Whereas-
I understand them trying to make it realistic because Superman would punch somebody very fast, very hard, and they would fly very fast.
yes.
But you can follow that on a comic book, but on a movie, it was hard
like-
to see what was happening.
Right. And here's the distinction that I would make in terms of showing that would be last year's Avengers, which is probably my favorite film in the history of anything ever. They had a similar huge battle sequence, but Joss Whedon made sure to punctuate it with
Slow it
moments
down.
of humor,
Yeah.
Yes.
slow it down. He went to very great pains. I've seen the movie like 15 times. He went to very great pains to show that the damage being done was being contained, that lives were being spared, that, okay, you just have to assume a lot of people died. But in the Battle of Metropolis, you're thinking, holy cow, like, upwards of 100,000 people must be dead. But in Avengers...
Right, but he also had the luxury of having an entire team of people that you can go spend 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. They're all not equally powerful, so they have to fight slower because most of them are humans. They're human beings.
Well, no. Well,
Hawkeye
I guess,
and
Black Widow.
And Black
But
Widow.
I thought he had done a job of just giving everybody little human moments throughout.
Yes.
So when Iron Man is willing to risk his life, you're kind of with that character on that journey. He was, that's a character I think where they showed the weakness and, it connected you to, and I just never felt connected to Superman in the same way.
Off the bat, in Man of Steel, he is willing to give himself up before any fighting takes place.
Yes.
He is ready to surrender himself as a hostage, basically.
And in one of the few quiet moments, I thought that was one of my favorite sequences, when he gives himself up, when he's in the room with Lois, and there's a little banter between them. And that was like one of the few, again, quieter character moments where people are just allowed to relate to each other, where I'm not being whacked over the head with some pummel,
I had a hard time believing in the romance, if that's you could even call it that, of him and Lois. Like, I felt there was no chemistry, no heat, nothing. You know, it was like kind of forced.
I felt it existed in that scene, but it was just never developed.
No.
They would rather have a big spaceship fight with dead Jor-El keeps popping up and affecting.
To me makes no sense. I mean, you know, you had it in the Donner film, you know. And
he's a program. He's a computer program.
But he was a lot more conscious.
But they're interacting with him in the present.
Yeah, and
he what happened in Donner film? He's talking to here, my son, and blah blah blah.
But
my
isn't
son.
that more of a past thing as opposed to here? He's interacting with Lois and telling her what to do.
I had a hard time with that at the end of the film, where Jor-El is really taking an active role in the story. I'm like, wait a minute, he's a computer program. I mean. You know,
I mean, if you're talking
about... Did you guys ever watch Automan back in the 80s?
I did, but...
He was a computer program, just like Tron.
Just like Tron. You don't need to explain anything. Yeah, I mean, I think I fall somewhere in the middle where I could say I like the film, but I had some real reservations about it. I didn't think it was the second coming of the way the Batman films were. You know, I think they tried to sort of take the Batman framework and imprint it on Superman, and that's not the character you do that with. You know, does that make sense? You know, like
you're trying to Dark Knight
Nolanize him, you know, kind of Nolanize him. I mean, Snyder's just visuals. I don't think he had much to do with anything except the tone, the pace, you know. But the story is Goyer and Nolan.
Well, did Whedon write the Avengers too?
Yes, he did.
I have a feeling Whedon probably would have done a better job with this movie.
I think he would too. I think Whedon is like I love him, you know.
Well, let me ask you a question. This is something I was wondering about. The ship in the ice that they find that's full of dead Kryptonians, I guess.
Yeah.
That he's walking through that ship. That's obviously not the ship he came in.
I guess that's the Fortress of Solitude supposed to be, yeah.
But
I think it's the Fortress.
But are we led to believe that is like an explorer ship that went out there thousands of years ago and landed on Earth and just crashed?
Yeah, I have no clue.
I don't know either.
And Zod, the Phantom Zone, is just basically a ship? What is the Phantom Zone?
Ship.
A prison ship?
Yeah, see that again. That was the story stuff that just
not
didn't really.
It's not another dimension.
Let's talk about
what it is in the comic.
Those grays that we were talking about. That I was talking about earlier. Zod is really not. Yes, he's a bad guy, but you could kind of slightly see his point of view in terms of he sees himself as the only person that can resurrect his race,
his people. Yeah,
and this guy has the key to that resurrection. And he's not a crazy evil scientist.
He's like
but he is
zealot.
using very questionable means to achieve his ends.
Well, you know, he could have asked nicely.
Could I have your genes?
But wouldn't that kill him? He was basically wanting to kill him, right?
I don't really know. Oh, he said that they could extract the codex from Superman, whether he was alive or dead. Yeah. If he was trying to give complexity to Zod by him saying, I know he did his little speech to, sorry, spoilers, Zod's little speech at the end about, you know, I'm just trying to save my race. That's what I was, you know, trying to do. Well, you know what? If you're willing to kill 8 million people, I'm not really that sympathetic to your cause.
That's because he's General Zod. He's not Citizen Zod.
Right.
And wasn't the implication, too, that, I mean, Zod wanted to, like, terraform Earth and make it like Krypton, but
he wanted to kill everyone on Earth.
Wasn't there another way? Like, wasn't Superman proposing? Am I just imagining this? But
no,
there was
I
no
think
other
he understands
solution?
that his people are not coming back.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the impression I got.
Well, it sounds like Jor-El put the codex into Superman because he basically wanted Superman to have kids and kind of bring Krypton back as kind of
intermarriage.
Yeah, basically, yeah. That's the way I understood it.
Not through terraforming.
It was through Lois Lane, basically.
Right.
That's how Jor-El seemed to, you know, have plans for the future.
Now, I think pretty much the first week the movie was out, they already announced that they are committed for a sequel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the movie's made buckets of money.
I can only hope.
Well, here's
the story and execution are a little handled better.
I hope with all the setup done, and now that he's at the Daily Planet and everything, that there's more room for...
Well, speaking of Daily Planet, again, this is another difference. Instead of him being introduced to the world through the Daily Planet as Clark Kent, he is now... And I guess the assumption is that...
Lois knows who he is.
It's the usual thing that nobody can tell his face. Okay, fine. We'll give him that because that's how it's always been. But Lois knows who he is.
Which is fine.
Yeah, I think that's good.
And that's a little Superman 2-ish.
It's a little tweaky. Yeah, but it doesn't seem like she's going to forget.
Right. Now, let me ask you another question. What was the point of Perry saving his... Was it supposed to show that he has a heart? He's a hard ass, but he has a heart.
See, this was another one of my issues with the movie.
What was the point
Perry
of
White
showing
was
that development between him saving his employees, two of them?
I think it's because Lawrence Fishburne needed more screen time.
Yeah.
And that role could have been played by anybody. There was nothing distinct about Perry White in this movie. And is it Jenny Olsen?
I think so.
Nobody had a moment.
Yeah.
None of them had a moment to distinguish them.
Right.
There was nothing likable or stand out about Perry White or Jenny Olsen. I don't really care that
Jenny
it's a woman
Olsen
instead of
supposed-
Jimmy
Jimmy
Olsen.
Jimmy Olsen.
Yeah, but I mean that's fine. But
yeah,
just,
but
there
just
was
do
nothing,
something.
I mean, in the Donner version, Perry White, was kind of this cantankerous newspaper editor and was kind of funny and yet serious.
Yeah,
so
all he does is have a couple of fights with Lois,
Yeah.
and then he's in the midst of all the carnage. Mm-hmm. There's really not a lot going on with him, and I think he's a fine actor.
Yeah,
but unless
they didn't give him anything to do.
Unless the inevitable Blu-ray might have some deleted scenes that I'd be very curious to see in terms of probably deleting exposition. And I mean, the movie was already 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Yeah, it was pretty long.
And
because God knows they couldn't cut any of those action scenes. And again, the other point, I'm just going to keep bitching.
Go ahead.
In the Battle of Smallville, which would have again been a nice moment when Superman gets thrown into the IHOP, and the kid
It was like
that he
something was
saved,
missing there. Like, what's the point?
There should have been a little moment.
Even if they had just made eye contact, I don't even think they got to the point of eye contact.
I don't think so.
And again, that's a weakness of the writing and the director.
Well, this brings us to the end of part 1 of our Man of Steel show. I'd like to thank Tony and Steve for joining me this week, helping us examine this film. And we invite you to join us next week when we will continue this conversation, because we still have a whole bunch of other subjects and topics that we want to hit. In addition, next week, we will also be joined by Tom LaSousa, one of our newest contributors, to give us his 2 cents on this new film. So on behalf of everybody here, please join us next week when we continue with part 2 of our Man of Steel show. Until then, we'll see you soon here at Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
You let them handcuff you?
Wouldn't be much of a surrender if I resisted. And if it makes them feel more secure, then
What's the S stand for?
it's not an S. On my world, it means hope.
Well, here it's an S. How about...
Sir?
Stop.
I agree with Tony.